For great-looking T-shirts, hoodies, and sweatshirts, the TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Connecting the dots. You're with Matt Arrett and Connecting the Dots on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome to Connecting the Dots on TNT Radio. I am your host, Matt Arrett, and with me today for the first part of the show is Joaquin Flores, a good friend. Many people who have heard past shows have already heard Joaquin in action. He is a director of the Center for Syncretic Studies. He is the curator of the Telegram channel New Resistance, one of the most important Telegram channels that I follow every day. I think it's one of the most insightful things on Telegram that I recommend everybody check out immediately. He's a great writer, an excellent analyst with a good sense of historical dynamics. So, Joaquin, thank you for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, there's a lot to talk about. We're entering right now a period of turbulence, let's just say that. As far as the journey of humanity in the grand scheme of things, there are periods of the good times, and there's periods of serious turmoil. Sometimes that turmoil is not dealt with by responsible people who should do what they should do or who do what they should do, and instead we have collapses, we have dark ages that litter human history. Obviously, this could go downhill very fast, but we also have a fight against this New World Order agenda, the depopulation agenda. And so the future is underdetermined as we go into the new year. A lot of points to talk about. And what I like about you, Joaquin, in your analysis and just chatting with you is that you are also sensitive to the fact that history and the future is based upon individuals making decisions around ideas that are true or false, and that the future is very underdetermined. A lot of people are quick to start complaining that everything is screwed, everything is controlled, it's all controlled opposition, or they're inversely just completely eating the steak in the matrix, saying, everything's fine, don't worry about it, just things will just work out. This is the kind of blind, silly faith, this absurd form of naive faith. You're a realist. You know things could go dark, but you also have a sense of the fight. We'll start with a big question before we zero in on some details. What's your general sentiment right now? Are you an optimist going into the new year and into the many years to come into the 21st century, or are you pulling towards the cynical side?
Matt, going into the coming year, coming into the next 5, 10, 15 years, there's a lot of things that I'm actually optimistic about. The things that we're seeing happen globally in terms of reorganization of the global economy, even though we hear a lot of I would call it birth pains coming from the controlled media paradigm, coming from oligarchical controlled mainstream corporate media, but that's just their orientation, right? Because they're looking at a world changing, and their way of doing things and the way that they have grown accustomed to making money and staying in power is so much connected to the way that things have been conducted for the past, number of decades, even centuries. So, we are actually in a very large transition economically, geopolitically, and more so than, you might talk about in terms of, like, let's say, the information age or something like that. So in other words, the types of changes that are happening are much more paradigmatic than simply, the types of technological changes that have been implemented in terms of either scientific or consumer goods for the past, let's say, 30 or 50 years. This is a much bigger change because of the way that the world is organized, right? In terms of supply line security, supply chains, who's producing, who's consuming, how much can they do in those arenas, and so forth. So I separate my analysis from the, like I said, the birth pains or the cries or the almost hysteria that we get from so much of the mainstream media. They, of course, want to transform their own uncertainties and insecurities about the future into calls for action, whether it's climate change, whether it's, more pressure against Russia, whatever it is. It is based upon their lived experiences, and it's real for them. It's real for them, but it's not our reality. So I'm optimistic about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to start this point out. Now there are a lot of different points to touch upon that I know the viewers are and listeners to the show are thinking about. You are somebody who is based in Serbia. You're following things very, very closely as far as different color revolutionary activities, asymmetrical warfare operations, things like that. I'm hearing messaging coming out of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, which is pointing out that the West is discussing replacing Zelensky, that the Ukraine gambit has reached its max and beyond. And that there's a discussion to replace Zelensky. Is there anything to it? And if they did replace Zelensky, who would they replace him with? And would it be better?
So there's a couple of things that have been coming out of media. We know that Zelensky's team, when Zelensky went to go to Argentina, he was denied entry into Brazil, and then he went to the United States. And in the United States, this happened about a week ago. His team came before him by a good weekend, maybe 5 working days even, including Yermak and others in his cabinet. And the inside story is coming from Resident Ukraine, which is a Ukrainian website, that the main request from his team, led by Yermak at the time, was to remove Zaluzhny, who's practically the head of the armed forces and a very respected general on the Ukrainian side. And his respect comes from the perception of his competence. In addition, within the kind of the back and forth within the Ukrainian inner fighting about, as we had that counteroffensive that started at the beginning of June, Zaluzhny was warning from the very beginning that without, for example, longer range missiles and air support and, let's say, attack helicopters like Russia has, that their counteroffensive would have a very difficult time of succeeding. And it looks a lot like Zelensky was behind kind of like the political push. And for those reasons, people have said that it reminded them very much of a famous World War II Battle of Kharkov, in which the Battle of Kursk, in which the Nazis had delayed their offensive for quite some time, and for political reasons were trying to accumulate force, and felt for political reasons that they had to attack. And this seems to be like a parallel that happened, a problem between the politics on one side and rational-minded military thinking on the other. So Zaluzhny is popular, but a lot of the stuff about Zaluzhny versus Zelensky, even though, and I've talked to some sources in Moscow, in politics, that say that this is a popular theory within Russian society too, but most of that energy or most of that reportage is coming from the Western and Ukrainian sources. So it's sort of, take it for, take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
But yeah, there are also Arestovich has talked about, who's a former Zelensky advisor, and he's similar to Zelensky in a lot of ways in terms of his background, with the exception that he had several years of military school, officer school at the Odessa school. So he's different in that he has probably a better grasp over Zelensky on military things. But similarly, he has a background of being an entertainer, a schmoozer, a kind of a person that gravitates towards, let's say, London and New York City vibes. He's into Broadway. He's also someone who is cross-dressed in television commercials and things like that. So he's an entertainer as well. But he is also an interesting person biographically. So he was active around Eurasian youth movement stuff, held conferences, was adjacent to people like Alexander Dugin, and co-hosted panels and things like this. So he has his at different times in his history, he's had his finger kind of in different pies, but it looks like he'd like to run. I don't know how seriously he would be taken within Ukrainian society, but if the right kind of alignment of oligarchs and forces in the U.S. were kind of behind him, then maybe you'd have something. So, but there are others. You kind of you have Poroshenko, you have the usual suspects, you have people. Even maybe Grandma, Timoshenko might want to make a stab at it. Who knows? All of these things are possible. But here's the problem: there are no elections happening in Ukraine anytime soon.
Right.
Right. So we're not talking about an election. What we're talking about is, what does the U.S. think about how should Ukraine be led, and, what are we doing with it? There are some creeping new rumors that the Ukrainian side might even announce that they're going to try another counteroffensive in 2024. This seems to me to be a disastrous change in their narrative. They had, if I may, just kind of arrived at how to explain why we need $60 billion. And it looked like they were hinting at, we need this to dig in so that we can build a complex echelon system of defenses, much like Russia had built. And that's something that people could believe in. I think from a strategic, tactical, and technological perspective, in terms of available pieces and what Ukraine would actually be able to get their hands on, I don't think that such a defense system would work. But at least you could understand how, as a category for spending, it makes sense, right? So Russia's now on the offensive. They have the initiative right now in about 50 to 60 different areas. Over the past week or two, Russia has made advances compared to maybe one or two places that Ukraine has been pushing without really any success. And so people kind of understand that Russia's now moving and Ukraine is playing defense. And so it made sense to say, hey, we could put this money towards defense. And then, after a year or whatever, and Russia doesn't make that much progress, maybe they'd like to end the war, maybe we'd like to end the war, and then come to some kind of ceasefire. They were talking at times, even Arestovich mentioned his knowledge that higher ups had discussed the Korea option, for example, right? Having a basically a line, maybe at the Dnieper River, and dividing things kind of east-west type of thing. So the New York Times just released a very interesting story talking about how how Zelensky's government had effectively been breaking the law in much of its efforts to force people into conscription.
Right.
And so it's, I think a lot of people knew that already, including the folks over at the New York Times. So the timing of that, because that just ran yesterday or today. Today's December 16th for folks.
Yeah, this has been going on. This has been going on for already almost 2 years, 18 months, and they're only picking this stuff up now. But the fact that they're choosing now at this moment to put this out as a public messaging does imply that some decisions, or this is a reflection of internal deliberations being made in a higher policymaking channel that we're not necessarily privy to. That's interesting that they're trying to derail or at least turn the trajectory of this thing into another direction. But do you really think that they're going to go for another counteroffensive after all of the life lost and disastrous embarrassments of all previous attempts?
It's at the very best, if they could muster a plan that would sound like it could work, then it might lead to Russians digging in places instead of taking further in the initiative they've begun. But it's hard to see that as credible unless you had, literally, 500 tanks, 2,000 or 3,000 infantry fighting vehicles or armored vehicles. You would need 100, at least 50 F-16s. You need a couple hundred attack helicopters. I mean, you have to be able to use them in ways that we've seen the Russians use them effectively.
You'd have to train your people to be able to wield these things on top of that, which is months and months. And
they didn't. Yeah. That's right, Matt. Thanks for reminding me. They only were managed to train between 30 or 40,000 people between Germany and England. Some reports say as few as 25,000. But the goal for the June counteroffensive, which was supposed to start in March or April, got pushed back and they said we're going to do it in May. And then they did do it in May, if you think that May has 37 days. And then what seems to have happened is they lost a lot of equipment, like in the first week. We're talking a very large amount of equipment. So,
yeah,
it is crazy talk, to be clear, because it's like, oh, now there's going to be equipment that we know doesn't exist, and they don't have the 155 millimeter shell. They don't have production for those, even in 2 or 3
Basically,
years.
what you're saying is there's a lot of self-deceit and illusion right now going on. People drinking their own Kool-Aid and not really thinking about what was spiked in it. But let me say this. Let's put this on it. We're going to go for a quick commercial break, and then we're going to come right back to Connecting the Dots on TNTRadio.live.
You should hear what Charlie Robinson is talking about.
I think once we saw the supply chain issues that happened during the COVID debacle, you go, well, that seems bad for when you're fighting somebody for toilet paper, but it could be worse, right? It could be the last can of food. So people are starting to reevaluate and reassess their situations and their relationship with supply chains and the like. And I think what that does is it leads you to a place of saying, how can I make myself less dependent on the system? It's kind of hard to know where to start, right? Where would you suggest we even begin with this process?
Yeah, it's funny you said that, because someone said to me recently, and it made me laugh, that this is going to be the kind of collapse where the Burger King's still open. And I think that's what's probably lulling people into a false sense of security, in that everything, when we go to the city, kind of appears normal, unless you're in one of those really crazy drug-addled cities. But for most people, I would say, Charlie, it feels normal, but it ain't normal. The world is not normal. It's completely gone off kilter.
Charlie Robinson on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
I'm just going to do a little voice off. 1 month on TV. I wanted to alleviate my pain. I also didn't want to be who I was. I always just felt like there was just something wrong with me, and I was trying to figure it out, and I used the internet to help me do that.
Seemingly out of nowhere, we've suddenly seen a huge spike in media depictions and social media depictions of transgenderism. It's even reached the mainstream advertising world.
The people who are consuming this are children, 13, 14, 15 years old, and it's so easy for them to literally be groomed.
I just woke up one day, looked at myself in the mirror, and asked myself, what the heck am I doing?
When trans-identified kids are referred to specialized gender clinics, they're often told that they're going to get comprehensive, multidisciplinary mental health assessments. We know that that's not true.
I was easy to manipulate.
The ideology that has become dominant at these clinics is that trans kids know who they are, and therefore to question them is completely taboo.
My childhood was ruined.
Who's there for their detransitioning? Nobody.
Nobody would help me because they had more concerns of me reversing everything.
Did this thing to alleviate this gender dysphoria that wasn't there before, but you made it into a problem, and now your body image issues are worse. That's not supposed to happen. What do we do now?
D-Trans, the dangers of gender-affirming care. For more information, go to prageru.com.
What do I love about writing? It's the thrill, the excitement. Writing gives me a sense of freedom. I feel so connected to the road. Writing is like therapy to me. It makes me feel alive. Love writing? Back off.
If you're still wearing a cloth or surgical mask around in public, you're guilty of spreading COVID misinformation. It really is that simple. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we're back with the second segment of our first hour. I got Joaquin Flores that we've been speaking to about geopolitical situations internationally, but specifically Ukraine. I wanted to carry this forward a little bit further before shifting gears a little bit. This week, Ursula von der Leyen exclaimed that we've achieved a historical moment in world history, with Viktor Orban saying we're not going to necessarily veto this discussion about Ukraine's entry into the European Union, or into the whole European boondoggle. Is that true? Is it, because I'm getting a lot of mixed messaging. I'm getting some messaging from the Hungarian foreign minister saying, well, actually, that's a little bit of a misrepresentation of the actual situation. Is Ukraine going to join the Eurozone, the European Union, or are we just being given propaganda?
Ukraine is not going to join the European Union in our lifetime, unless, things with such a low statistical probability of occur. There's so much misrepresentation to the public about the process, and what the EU actually is and how it functions. And so, they would need to make so many changes to the EU to allow a country like Ukraine to join, but that would be Ukraine, like complete Ukraine. So just sort of to reverse a little bit what the chronology of the mix-up was that, so by and large, it's been clear that Hungary, but there's other states as well, including France. I mean, Macron just made a statement that there's no chance that Ukraine's going to enter the EU anytime soon as well. So these are not bizarre things that Orban has said. In fact, they are in line with every study and every assessment that's been made at the official level. So it's just an inconvenient truth that that's actually what the EU thinks. But then you have EU commissioners, you have the Zelensky's media team, you have Western media creating an alternate reality that doesn't reflect actually what the EU, the Commission, and their committee on new member states has already found. Right, like there's a number of areas that Ukraine not only falls short, but even in the areas that they don't fall short, they're actually not compatible with the economic needs of countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, just for instance. So it has to do with the volume of goods, prices, and market distortions that occur. And, then you get into the fact that it would probably take 3-4 years for EU countries to agree on what a special case like Ukraine would be. And this is so hypothetical, Matt, because we're talking about Ukraine that's not at war. So you can't have an EU country, have a border dispute, be at war with a nuclear power or, whatever, right? This is not possible. And then what makes Ukraine interesting to the EU potentially consist of places like the Donbass and Crimea, which together make up, depending on the estimate, between 60 and 80% of Ukraine's economy. That discrepancy has to do with to what degree you project or financialize those assets, because those are real assets, that productive assets, industrial and natural resources. And so that's not realistic. That, in other words, Ukraine must first win the war. No one believes that that's going to happen. So then you're talking about, let's say, assume a Ukraine that only has the agricultural stuff, which is what it has right now by and large. Well, that's just terrible for other grain producing countries like Bulgaria and Romania, right, et cetera. So they won't allow it. You have right now, right, like the Polish have been at the border. They've been protesting. They petitioned government, and the government has put a blockade on Ukrainian goods. So these are things that the EU had wanted Poland to be lax about, and Poland was lax about it for like a year and a half almost.
With the new president of Poland, or prime minister. I'm forgetting now which one.
Prior with the past president, that was one of the things that probably cost that probably caused us to return. It probably caused the outgoing guys to lose because they had been
Is Tusk going to reverse those more sane policies, or is he going to continue?
Well, he's talking that way because he's trying to line up support and line up his ducks and then do some kind of sequence of stunts like he's known to do. But realistically, no. I mean, realistically, no. The incentive from the United States would have to be so great. But then it's like, what is the U.S. really trying to do? I mean, they're not actually serious about trying to, further the conflict with Ukraine. So they don't have. It would be great for them if Europe would somehow have taken on the burden. But burden sharing has been a dead end. There has been generally a failure on the part of the U.S., UK to get the Franco-German power, what we call the EU, to take more of the burden in this conflict. So the last piece was maybe that 40 or 50 billion could come from the EU. And that's now going down these are just things that are leaked and hypothesized, and they generate headlines, which gives the wrong type of people the wrong type of hope for 5 or 6 days, and then reality kicks back in. And it's this very strange drug that we seem to be on in media, like surrounding, I would call it the process of grief, right? Like the stages of grief, and you kind of have like denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and stuff like that. And we're kind of getting towards that stage of acceptance, but there's been that kind of bargaining and denial and this kind of back and forth stuff going on. And that's what you see, I think, largely in press.
Yeah, it's interesting to be living through these sorts of times of systemic rupture, systemic change, because in previous years, there was a relative coherence behind the visual messaging, or the messaging you would hear in the corporate media, and the so-called reality you were allowed to believe in. That maybe they were two different things, but whatever the oligarchy, those controllers of the big narratives wanted people to believe, there wasn't too much challenging those beliefs. So whether it was around the cause of why 2 buildings or 3 buildings collapsed in America, or the reasons why we had to just go in and overthrow certain leaders for the public, for the greater good in the Middle East, like Gaddafi, we were given certain messaging, and that wasn't really questioned so much. And all of a sudden, in the recent years, especially since Trump's election in 2016, there's been a break, increasing degrees of break between the messaging and reality, forcing a very interesting bit of mental gymnastics from us watching things, making sense and trying to triangulate into reality. We will see these things with these absolute proclamations from Ursula von der Leyen or whatever talking head is saying something about world history changing in our midst, and then all of a sudden within 2 days, it's just dropped down memory hole as if it was never said, because reality isn't working out that way.
I mean, specifically about Ukraine and the EU, what people don't seem to understand is that, the EU, most of these EU accession agreements have about 20-something chapters, and they each take about 6 months to negotiate. I mean, that's at full steam ahead. When you look at the history of states that have joined the EU, and you look at the amount of negotiating that went into it, it was going on for quite a long time. And, and that's not even including, so that might be, 8 years or 10 years at warp speed. But you need another couple of years before that to get other member states to agree on how you would deal with such a, market distorting influence like Ukraine. And then the issue of the war. I mean, it's impossible, like on 6 different levels, that it's just stupid. I mean, it would take 3 hours to deconstruct one simple lie. That's the problem with misinformation, by the way, is that, so many more words, because you're like, well, here's the background, here's the real story, here's what's going to happen. Whereas all that the other person has to do is just say some nonsense like Ukraine's going in the EU, and it's, that's why big claims require big evidence. That's why we do that. And no one claiming that Ukraine is on the way into the EU has provided any evidence that's fitting into the picture at all.
We have about 7 minutes before our next commercial break, and I want to get your thoughts on some material regarding North America, or specifically Latin America and Mexico. But before we do that, I think that'll be something we tackle after the break for our last segment. But quickly, is there any resistance within Europe, within the industrial groups of the parts of the oligarchy within the European zone, who are obviously being flushed by the destruction of Nord Stream? The economy is constantly being tanked. Industrial agriculture is being targeted for shutdown. Are there any forces that have strength, whether in France or in Germany, that you can identify, which have a chance at doing some combat and bringing in some more sane orientation for sovereign nations of Europe to survive this thing?
I do think so. Well, first of all, you have the most of, with France, we can harken back to the yellow vests. We know that this represented a diverse group of French, on the case of France, for example, very diverse. We're talking about people that would be associated with independent small businesses, business owners, entrepreneurs, labor, the Trade Union Confederation, and sort of you're in Europe on the model of keeping World War II alive. The system has hitherto succeeded in kind of compartmentalizing people into these left and right categories, where the small businesses and the ideology of small business owners saw that the threat from labor unions and radical leftists was more of a threat than, let's say, the state. And today, people are seeing that the state as it exists and the mega corporations which support that state and vice versa, transnationals, multinationals, that these are the greatest threat. So you saw with the yellow vests a number of years ago, this collusion and this coming together of forces that might be considered left and right. And moreover, when you're talking about Germany and France and the project with the crash course that Atlanticists have placed for Europe in its fight against Russia in Ukraine, this is now bringing together an even bigger coalition that involves not just in France, but also in Germany, Italy, Spain, other countries in Western Europe. But speaking in the case of Germany and France, because they lead so much of the EU when it comes down to it, it's very clear that the industrialists, whether you're talking about Siemens or any of the big producers, Daimler, et cetera, these are companies that are based in the physical economy, Matt. And so when you look at Germany, for example, and you look at all the G7 countries, right? Like, because of what Scholz has committed Germany to in a kind of a kamikaze suicide pact fashion in its conflict against Russia in Ukraine, Germany right now is paying 1.6, 1.7 times the median price of energy for G7 countries. So they are not competitive right now. They have no way of being competitive. This is now going to lead, of course, to the next stage of cost push inflation in Europe. So, and industrialists can see what's coming. People who own stock in those, right? So also people that are gaming stock markets, but maybe they don't want to get out of those because they have long-term investments, or they have a long-term investment strategy. So when you're talking about investors, whether you're talking about the institutions themselves, the big industrial and productive forces in Europe, their employees, civil society, most pluralist institutions, like, this is a silent majority, Matt, that is against this collision course in Ukraine. So there's more than hope. It's really just a matter of time. And I don't suspect there's going to be some kind of social revolution in Western Europe. Hopefully, the elites just kind of pretend they didn't try this and kind of move on and kind of, like they normally do. But we'll see what happens. In the last address, just in 20 seconds, Putin did like a question and answer session the other day. It's a big one that they do every year except for last year. And it is very clear that Russia is looking to quickly restore and engage as soon as possible with relations with the U.S. And that conforms to my general line of forecasting that, even if Ukraine jumps the shark, and especially if Europe somehow gets firmly behind Ukraine, I think the play is going to be against Europe, and that you could even find some type of back channel or even overt coordination between the U.S. and Russia if somehow something crazy happens in Europe and Europe goes all in backing Ukraine. But those are the type of scenarios that, we forecast or look at what are the probabilities of those happening. They're very real.
Had myself on mute there. Joaquin just referenced the very important annual address by Vladimir Putin, which I highly recommend if people listening are not aware that Putin does this every year, off-the-cuff dialogues with hostile media, friendly media, the people, leaders of nations, every year. His stamina is outstanding. No little mouthpiece speaking into his ear telling him what to say like we have with certain talking heads in the West. It's fascinating to listen to. I highly recommend taking the 3-4 hours, whatever it takes, to sit down and watch it, take some notes. Very fascinating stuff. Thank you, Joaquin. We're going to go in for a quick little break, and we're going to jump back in to discuss Mexico.
With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Timothy Shea.
Stop letting leftists set the agenda. Stop letting them turn nothing burgers into the most pressing issues of the day. Stop letting them use words like inclusion, equity, fairness, and diversity as cudgels to beat you into submission. Stop bowing, stop scraping, stop bending the knee, and stop giving them what they desire, an abject apology, assuring them that they'll get their way and everything will be fine. Because it won't be fine. That won't be the last complaint. Every time you submit to them, you encourage them. You give them more fuel for their next attack. And it will go on for decades. The Onondaga Nation complained to Syracuse University about the Saltine Warrior mascot in 1978. And here we are, 45 years later, the Onondaga Nation is complaining to Liverpool High School about using warriors as their athletic mascot. For 45 years it was fine, but now all of a sudden in 2023 it's not. Stop giving in to this culture of destruction. From MAGAInstitute.com, this is Timothy Shea for TNT Radio.
Life doesn't always give you time to change the outcome. Prediabetes does. 1 in 3 adults has prediabetes, but with early diagnosis, prediabetes can be reversed. And you can change the outcome. Take the 1-minute prediabetes risk test today. Go to doihaveprediabetes.org.
Matt Arrett and Connecting the Dots on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome back for the third part of our first hour with Joaquin Flores. We've just been speaking a lot about Eastern Europe, the combat of the collective West in this kamikaze suicide pact, as you called it, against the possibility of something challenging the dream of hegemony, of this new world order, of a depopulated utopia where the elites know their place, partying in their castles, and the masses, the plebes, are happy eating grass and bugs. But there is certain disturbances in the illusion, which makes life interesting right now to be living in and moving in. I want to bring this discussion, as we noted, a little bit into North America, and specifically over dynamics that are unfolding in Mexico. Mexico under Obrador has been pulled in also very different directions. We recently had Xi Jinping meeting with Obrador last month on the sidelines of a certain summit that happened in the United States, and discussions around economic development with Eurasia. But we've also had Mexico being pulled into a very another darker dynamic. We're hearing a lot of discussions even from a lot of Republicans about the need to militarily invade Mexico, even maybe before the elections that are scheduled in 2024 January. So could you say something about that? Is there really a threat of U.S. invasion? Why would they be doing this? What's going on?
Well, so yeah, there is a threat, and unfortunately, as I'm tracking this, it is a growing threat, and it's something that I'm happy to get out of kind of ahead of the curve here with you on connecting the dots, because this isn't something that I've spoken about anywhere else yet, and I've seen there's been a deafening silence from, alternative media, and there's been a lack of focus on Mexico in general, which is interesting, but it's difficult. Mexico doesn't get a lot of treatment, but yeah, there's a very big threat. If I could just say really quick, the reason that I think Mexico doesn't get a lot of treatment is that a lot of the conservative forces in the U.S. Don't really think about Mexico that much, independently of like immigration and illegal immigration, which they're against, understandably. And then the left. They play a very disingenuous game in analyzing leaders of developing countries, often because even though many of these leftists come from traditionally colonial imperialist countries themselves, and haven't had any success in overthrowing their own ruling class, they nevertheless proceed to criticize developing countries for having leaders that aren't like hardcore communists or hardcore enough, whatever. And of course, in Mexico, Obrador, or we call him AMLO because it's short for his whole, four name. What is it? Antonio Manuel Luis Obrador. So we just say AMLO. He's a centrist that used to be from the left and led a left coalition, but then brought in ultra conservatives to make a new movement called Moreno. And, having done that brought a lot of ire from the traditional left, because he's doing something you're not allowed to do, a little bit syncretic, which is the no, bad thing to do nowadays. So by bringing together kind of traditional forces of the right and the left in a new alliance of national renaissance, is what Moreno stands for, they criticize the position that they criticize Mexico from the point of view of the Mexico that AMLO inherited. And then they foment further criticisms based upon really no true Scotsman fallacies. So there's not enough focus on Mexico. For the past couple of years...
Sorry, when you just said two Scotsman fallacies, what is this?
The no true Scotsman fallacies, like, that a no true Scotsman fallacy people will know. There's that no true Scotsman would do no true, Mexican leader would do the things that AMLO has done. Why?
Oh, I see.
Well, a true Mexican leader would say, go F yourself, United States, because that's right. The fantasy of what like a leftist in the U.S. wants world leaders to say, right? When
right. So it's like a pre-existing category that you're supposed to fit into makes you true in whatever category. Okay, yeah, I got you.
But you can never reach that, right? So, yeah. It's an unreachable standard. But the reality is that at the Democrat debates that occurred that, very few people watched, but this was when Biden was, at 9 or 10%. It was totally strange how he got the nomination anyway. Bernie was actually leading in many indexes. And there was no way that Biden, would have won that nomination fair and square. But we know about Buttigieg and the shadow app and things that going back to the iOS straw poll, et cetera. One of the things that they were debating about, Matt, was should the U.S. invade Mexico? And this was a literal question that was brought up a number of times. So as a Democrat question, and almost all of them had a positive thing to say, like, yes, under these conditions, we should invade Mexico. Well, throughout the past couple of years, this was taken up by Dan Crenshaw, congressman from Texas, and others as well. But they're Republicans. So they're ostensibly you would invade Mexico, but not against the Mexican government, right? But to take out the narco trafficking cartels. But the Mexican government's been very clear, like, hey, we think that you guys are financing, like your CIA is like financing a number of these cartels. And the script just seems a little bit too much like ISIS in Syria, right? Obama ostensibly got the U.S. involved in Syria not to overthrow Assad, even though they were saying Assad must step down. The reason was to fight ISIS. And even though Assad was fighting ISIS, right? And Assad is like, you saying you're here to fight ISIS is like seriously destroying our ability to fight ISIS, right? So, because in fact, you're attacking us. And so such a thing, mission creep or just misrepresenting the point of the operation is what we would likely find from neocons like Crenshaw. And it's the reason that it is a very high probable issue to take off before election time is because it would allow Biden to commit force and be a wartime president, but not in a conflict that you have like in Ukraine that sets off all those triggers and the potential conflict with Russia. So there's not a lot of concern, militarily that a conflict in Mexico would result in some type of blowback or, Mexico is not going to nuke anybody. They don't have nuclear weapons and things like this. So, and it's also something that a lot of the Republican or conservative voters might approve of, right? The idea of the U.S. invading Mexico, because this is like securing the border. I mean, this could start like we need, with Biden doing something like I'm going to send the U.S. military to secure the border, and then it's going to be a lot of those Trump supporters that wanted better border security, right? Although many of them would never endorse invading because many of those same voters are totally against the forever wars, right? But we know that slippery slope, mission creep. We send them to the border. Oh, now they're crossing into the border because they've been attacked by these traffickers or narco cartels. And so, well, let's say that we will cross the border to pursue, but we're not going to cross the border unless we're to pursue them. Oh, well, now we're going to set up a temporary base in Chihuahua or Zacatecas or wherever, they can keep going deeper into the interior of Mexico, Durango or wherever. So this is going to be a big problem. And it's something that would be very divisive for Trump voters and also make Biden appear to be doing something that appeals to that segment of the electorate as we get into the next election, coming up this year. So for all those reasons, it's a danger. I mean, it's literally been talked about. There are tons. That means that plans exist, of course, if it's being talked about at this level. It was something that the DNC, because we know how staged those 2020 debates were. It's something that the DNC obviously knows very well that the permanent administration and military and CIA, of course, have plans around, right? It's something that when we first saw that come up in the debate is like, that meme that's like nobody and then U.S., let's invade Mexico. It's like, that's what it totally was. I mean, where did this come from? Totally left field. Nobody was literally talking about this. So it's a great concern.
No, absolutely. And it also puts a little bit more meat on the bones when many people were surprised during the last parade celebrating Independence Day in Mexico that the Chinese and the Russians were invited to have military delegations marching alongside the Mexican military, which, again, certain people were caught off guard by this, but it was clearly a not too subtle message for those in the know about what not to do regarding certain topics that you were just raising just there. What do you think, though, of the broader orientation of Mexico within the Eurasian future? Do you think that there's a chance of Mexico being able to deal with its narco terror ISIS problem that's been cultivated by Western intelligence banking for many, many decades and finally free itself of these problems by going towards a pro-development, pro-nation state orientation of Eurasia?
Mexico has a population approximately the same size as Russia's. They are a huge oil producer. Mexico is. One of the fights right now is in bringing is in re-sovereigntizing Pemex. This is one of the projects, one of AMLO's midterm, long-term projects to re-sovereigntize Pemex. Pemex was established, I think, under Cardenas during the great nationalizations in the 30s, and over time they were privatized, but they were privatized in the beginning like in a responsible way to Mexican oligarchs. But over time, it was possible to sell those to foreign interests. So kind of in the discourse about nationalization or socialization, which is more of a 20th century debate, but in geopolitical terms, what you're talking about is sovereigntization versus desovereigntization. So you can keep something sovereign and it can be partly privatized or whatever, or mostly privatized. But so long as the revenues, and the proceeds have to be within the national bank. So the oligarchs that own it, they get the proceeds, but those proceeds have to stay in the government state national bank, not a Swiss bank account, not in Cyprus or offshore, whatever. And that also about what you can do with that investment, right? Like, can you take the returns and then invest in another country? So all those things would kind of undermine Mexico's sovereignty. So, one of the simple solutions, though, that creates kind of the distortions in state control, though, has been to nationalize things. And, by and large, that's the better option compared to it not being under your control at all, right? Having bleeding your resources just around the world, global oligarchs just vampirizing your oil wealth, right? So you've got that one issue, but, so Mexico's on the up and up, and their economy's been growing. And in terms of, regional spheres and multipolarity, Mexico has a dynamic economy that should complement the United States. The United States, in terms of its future, is in integrating in various ways with Mexico and the Latin American economies, right? Mm-hmm. But these have to be ways that are from the middle out and from the bottom up, so that they're not just a rehash of American imperialism, right? Yeah. United Fruit, the U.S. tin, U.S. steel, these, have long plagued countries like Chile, like Argentina, like Mexico, Cuba, et cetera. So we have to get past this 20th century discourse. But when the United States looks realistically at, disinvesting from its efforts in the Middle East, or getting out of thinking they're going to create Rumsfeld, new Europe, and have, be backing Latvia and Poland like Ukraine to have kamikaze suicide missions against Russia, or to think that you're going to, play Japan as the new Poland against China, Taiwan. Like, these are all stupid intrigues that are far outsized for a waning power like the United States. And for the United States to take what it has, right, and then reemerge in the next 20, 30 years, right, as a powerful state that isn't overreached around the world, that's going to be the United States as a land power, very much like Eurasian land power, Chinese land power, African land power. The United States, it's natural, right? It's only natural and therefore good, if done the right way, that they integrate into the Latin American economy. So, but we're in the period of growing pains, and we're in a paradigm shift in terms of how do American elites perceive that process? Like, do they feel like it's a white man's burden? Do they think they're going to be doing nation building or democratization, or is it going to be honest, right? So it's like,
well, I think looking at Donald Trump had a policy with Obrador that involved, I think the promise was something like some big numbers, something like $200 billion in investments into high-speed rail electrification, a new grid for Mexico South, and that would also involve three of the big poor countries adjacent to Mexico in Central America that would be incorporated into a process of large-scale economic development. I think the Mayan Rail came out of that process, and all of this stuff was sabotaged from within Trump's administration. And obviously, this is very different from the type of people who are pushing for the North American Union idea of centralizing the economy and integrating things, but through a system of controls for a master class that don't care about doing things in the real economy, which incorporate and transform the people in a way that makes people live better, live happier, lives, and increase the power of the sovereign nation state to have industrial activity, which allows for economic sovereignty and decision-making outside of a centralized bureaucracy. So it's a very different idea, and it's important for people to look at what Trump was actually bringing online that was challenging this sort of oligarchist structure, especially for South America and Mexico.
And dovetailing on that, what you're saying is spot on that. And part of this industrialization and investment scheme or plan, if you will, scheme is British, it doesn't mean bad. The scheme would involve so much capital influx into Mexico and development, right? So what does that do to the Mexican economy, and what are the signals that you send to the world and locally, right? So that would be the biggest, very much like the French and Italian and Russian investments into Libya, right? That transformed Libya under Gaddafi's leadership. And you had all of this other potentially migrant labor from Africa that instead of going into Europe was in Libya. So Mexico, in terms of El Salvador, Guatemala, or keeping Mexican labor in Mexico, that would have been, the solution to illegal immigration.
Absolutely. This is not magic. This is over obscured sometimes, but it's very important to take the words of Joaquin Flores very, very seriously. Thank you so much for elucidating our audience about some important, overly complexified dynamics and making them simple and intelligible. Where can people reach you?
Telegram, New Resistance, @New Resistance is the best way. Thanks.